Some people may not know this about the Pontiac Aztek, but it was far more forward thinking than most people gave it credit for. Introduced for the 2001 model year, the Aztek arrived at a time when crossover vehicles were still a developing idea. It combined SUV utility with car like proportions long before the segment fully took over the market. What made it interesting was its versatility. It offered available all wheel drive, a V6 engine producing around 185 horsepower, and one of the most configurable interiors of its time. There was even an optional camping package with a tent attachment designed to integrate with the rear hatch. It was often misunderstood because of its styling. The sharp lines and layered cladding divided opinion immediately. For many, the appearance overshadowed the practicality and thoughtful packaging underneath. What made it matter was timing. The Aztec anticipated the rise of lifestyle crossovers, blending cargo space, flexibility, and everyday usability in one vehicle. Looking back now, the Pontiac Aztec feels less like a mistake and more like an early draft of a segment that would soon dominate the automotive landscape. Some people may not know this about the Saturn SC1, but it represented one of the most unique experiments in American small car manufacturing. Introduced in the early 1990s, the SC1 was part of Saturn's original mission to compete directly with compact imports using a completely different approach. What made it interesting was its construction. The SC1 used polymer body panels mounted over a steel space frame, which meant the exterior resisted dents and corrosion better than many competitors. Under the hood sat a single overhead cam, 1.9-liter four-cylinder focused more on efficiency than outright performance. It was simple, durable, and easy to live with. It was often misunderstood because it was never marketed as a performance coupe. The styling suggested sportiness, but the SC1 prioritized fuel economy and reliability over speed. For some buyers, that mismatch shaped expectations. What made it matter was its philosophy. Saturn aimed to change how small cars were sold and supported, emphasizing customer experience and low-cost ownership. Looking back now, the Saturn SC1 stands as a reminder of a time when American manufacturers tried a completely different formula to win compact car buyers. Some people may not know this about the Geostorm, but it was never truly just a Geo. Introduced in the early 1990s, the Storm was actually built by Isuzu and shared its foundation with the Isuzu Impulse. At a time when compact coupes filled dealership lots, this one quietly carried more substance than many realized. What made it interesting was its simplicity. Lightweight, front-wheel drive, and powered by a small displacement four-cylinder engine, the Storm was not about brute force, it was about balance and accessibility. In GSI form, it featured a dual overhead cam engine that was eager to rev and gave the car a sharper personality than its modest size suggested. It was often misunderstood because of the badge on the hood. Geo was known primarily for economy cars, so many assumed the Storm was simply a sporty appearance package. Underneath, however, the engineering had real intent. What made it matter was timing. It arrived during a period when affordable coupes were still common, insurance was manageable, and lightweight design still defined the driving experience. Looking back now, the Geostorm represents a time when simple, compact coupes offered honest driving character without complication. Some people may not know this about the 1996 Chevy Impala SS. It wasn't built to chase trends, it was built to make a statement. When Chevrolet reintroduced the Impala SS in the mid 1990s, the automotive world had already moved on from full size performance sedans. Cars were getting smaller, lighter, and more efficient. Chevrolet went the other direction, and they did it deliberately. The Impala SS was large, heavy, and unapologetic. Rear wheel drive, a V8 under the hood, a chassis tuned for stability and confidence instead of sharp handling. This wasn't nostalgia, it was intent. Here's where the misunderstanding comes in. Many people expected the Impala SS to behave like a sports car. When it didn't, they dismissed it. But the SS was never about corner carving or drama. It was about presence and authority. On the road, the car felt planted and composed. The torque was immediate. Highway speeds felt effortless. Long distances disappeared without effort. This was performance designed for the real world, not a racetrack. The Impala SS didn't fail because it lacked ability. It faded because the market shifted away from what it represented. As SUVs took over and sedans lost favor, cars like this quietly disappeared. That's why the 1996 Impala SS matters. It represents one of the last moments when American manufacturers believed a full-size sedan could still be powerful, desirable, and respected. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't delicate, but it was honest. And in hindsight, that honesty is exactly why the Impala SS has become so revered. Some people may not know this about the 1992 Ford Escort GT 5-speed, but it was one of the most honest front-wheel drive driver's cars you could buy in the early 1990s. It didn't look extreme. It wasn't turbocharged. It didn't shout. But underneath, it had something most small coupes of the time didn't: a Mazda-sourced 1.8-liter twin-cam engine, a proper 5-speed manual, and suspension tuning that actually rewarded you for paying attention. That combination mattered. The Escort GT wasn't trying to win drag races. It was about momentum, about balance, about keeping your foot in it through corners instead of relying on horsepower to fix mistakes. And here's what made it special: it was attainable. You didn't need exotic money. You didn't need a performance badge with attitude. You just needed to care about driving, because when you drove one hard, it came alive. The engine liked to rev, the chassis felt light, the steering gave feedback that most economy cars never bothered to offer. It was simple, it was mechanical, and it was engaging. The Escort GT didn't build a legend, it built memories, and sometimes that's more important. Some people may not know this about the Chevrolet Beretta. It wasn't a bad car. It was simply caught between eras. When Chevrolet introduced the Beretta in the late 1980s, it was designed as a compact front-wheel drive coupe at a time when the industry was shifting away from traditional rear-wheel drive performance. Muscle cars were disappearing, fuel efficiency mattered, and manufacturers were trying to figure out what performance meant in a new context. The Beretta wasn't trying to be a Camaro or a Corvette. It was built to be accessible, affordable, practical, but it also offered something unexpected: real performance options. V6 power, manual transmissions, and eventually genuine motorsports credibility. Here's where the misunderstanding began. Early versions were judged alongside economy cars, not performance coupes, and because the Beretta didn't look aggressive or dramatic, many people dismissed what it could actually do. But the Beretta GT and later the GTZ proved otherwise. Strong, straight line performance, respectable handling for the time. And in racing, the Beretta dominated IMSA and SCCA competition in its class, earning more wins than many cars people still praise today. What made the Beretta special wasn't refinement or prestige, it was purpose. It delivered performance to buyers who couldn't afford sports cars at a time when the industry was redefining itself. The Chevrolet Beretta didn't fail. It served its role exactly as intended. It just lived in an era where subtle performance didn't get credit. That's why the Beretta matters. It represents a forgotten chapter in American performance, one where speed was made accessible, not aspirational, and like many cars judged by image instead of intent, it deserves a second look. Some people may not know this about the first generation Ford Probe GT. It wasn't a mistake. It was simply misunderstood. When Ford introduced the Probe in the late 1980s, the automotive world was changing fast. Fuel efficiency mattered, aerodynamics mattered, and manufacturers were trying to move away from the muscle car formula that no longer fit the moment. The Probe was Ford's attempt to look forward instead of backward. The GT version added capability, but that was never the headline. The Probe wasn't designed to be loud or aggressive. It was designed to be modern, front-wheel drive, a sleek aerodynamic shape, Japanese engineering influence through Mazda. It was a car built for balance, efficiency, and everyday usability. Here's where the problem started. The Probe was widely rumored to be a future replacement for the Mustang. That comparison followed it everywhere, even though the car itself never asked for it. People didn't judge the Probe for what it was, they judged it for what it wasn't. Owners, however, understood it differently. The first generation Probe GT was comfortable, reliable, and genuinely enjoyable to drive. It handled well, it felt planted, and it delivered exactly what it promised without drama or pretense. The Probe didn't fail. It sold well, earned loyal owners, and helped Ford bridge an important transitional era. But history remembered the controversy instead of the context. That's why the first generation Ford Probe GT matters. It represents a moment when the industry was experimenting, adapting, and learning. It wasn't trying to replace a legend, it was trying to move the conversation forward. And like many cars built for change instead of nostalgia, it was appreciated most by the people who actually lived with it. Some people may not know this about the Pontiac Bonneville SSEI. It wasn't boring, it was just quiet about what it could do. When Pontiac built the SSEI in the 1990s, performance sedans weren't supposed to exist in the mainstream. Muscle cars were gone, rear-wheel drive was fading, and most front-wheel drive cars were judged as compromises. Pontiac ignored that thinking and built something unexpectedly serious: Under the hood was a supercharged V6 delivering strong torque and instant response, not tuned for drama, but for real world speed, merging, passing, highway pulls. This was performance you felt without needing to announce it. Here's where the misunderstanding happened. The Bonneville SSEI didn't look fast, no flares, no wings, no aggressive stance. To most people, it looked like a comfortable family sedan, and that's exactly why it worked. Front wheel drive performance was done right here. The chassis was tuned for stability, not showmanship. The suspension handled power without chaos. The car stayed composed even when pushed, which was rare at the time. What made the SSEI special wasn't how it sounded or how it looked. It was how effortlessly quick it was. It didn't demand attention. It didn't beg for praise. It just moved. That's why the Pontiac Bonneville SSEI matters. It represents a moment when performance was subtle, usable, and integrated into everyday cars. Long before performance sedans became a category, this one quietly proved the idea worked. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was fast before fast was cool. Some people may not know this about the Honda S2000. It wasn't built to feel fast everywhere. It was built to be precise at the limit. When Honda released the S2000 at the end of the 1990s, it wasn't chasing muscle car torque or grand touring comfort. This was a statement car, a naturally aspirated four-cylinder, rear-wheel drive, a six-speed manual, and an engine that asked the driver to meet it halfway. The S2000's defining feature was its engine, high-revving, tightly wound, and deliberately peaky. It didn't offer effortless power at low speeds. Instead, it rewarded commitment. The harder you drove it, the more it gave back. Here's where it became misunderstood. Many drivers expected it to behave like a torque-heavy sports car. When it didn't, they called it difficult or lacking power, but that assumes it was designed for casual driving. It wasn't. The S2000 was engineered around balance and precision, near perfect weight distribution, a rigid chassis, steering that communicated exactly what the front tires were doing. Everything worked together when driven with intent. What made it special wasn't how easy it was how honest it was. The car didn't hide mistakes, it didn't smooth over inputs, it simply responded. The S2000 didn't try to be everything. It chose focus over comfort, precision over convenience, and because of that, it became one of the last truly analog sports cars built by a major manufacturer. That's why the Honda S2000 matters. It represents a time when engineering excellence meant trusting the driver instead of protecting them. Loved by those who understood it and misunderstood by those who didn't, it remains a benchmark for how pure a modern sports car could be. Some people may not know this about the 1991 Dodge Daytona. It wasn't a muscle car replacement, it was something entirely different. By the early 1990s, the traditional American muscle formula was gone. Emissions rules, fuel economy, and changing tastes had reshaped the industry. Dodge didn't try to pretend otherwise. Instead, the Daytona embraced the moment it was built for. The Daytona was front-wheel drive, turbocharged, and compact. That alone confused people who expected rear-wheel drive and big V8 power, but the goal wasn't nostalgia, it was relevance. The Daytona was designed to be quick, efficient, and usable in everyday driving. Here's where it became misunderstood. Because it didn't fit the old muscle car image, many dismissed it as a compromise, but in reality, the Daytona delivered performance where it mattered most: strong mid-range power, lightweight handling, real speed on real roads. The 1991 models represented a refined version of the concept: better drivability, improved reliability, and a platform that had already proven itself in racing and motorsports throughout the decade. This wasn't an experiment anymore, it was a mature idea. What made the Daytona important wasn't how dramatic it looked, it was how well it adapted. Dodge used turbocharging and smart engineering to keep performance alive during a period when many brands struggled to do so at all. The Daytona didn't fail, it evolved with its time. And when the market moved on again, it was left behind, not because it lacked ability, but because the next shift was already underway. That's why the 1991 Dodge Daytona matters. It represents a chapter in American performance that doesn't get enough credit, one where ingenuity mattered more than tradition, and performance survived by changing shape instead of disappearing. Before we get into this car, a quick personal note. My first car was a first generation Ford EXP, and the photo you're seeing is actually me with that car. It wasn't fast, it wasn't rare, but it's where my relationship with cars really started. And that's exactly why the Ford EXP matters. Some people may not know this about the first generation Ford EXP. It wasn't meant to be exciting, it was meant to be efficient, affordable, and thoughtful during a moment when the automotive world was trying to change direction. When Ford introduced the EXP in the early 1980s, fuel economy and practicality mattered more than performance. Muscle cars had faded, and manufacturers were experimenting with smaller, lighter vehicles that could survive a new reality. The EXP was Ford's attempt to build something modern, aerodynamic, and accessible. Here's where it became misunderstood. Because it wasn't powerful or aggressive, many people dismissed it as disposable. But the EXP wasn't pretending to be something else. It was honest about its purpose: lightweight, simple, easy to live with. For many people, it was a first step into car ownership. For me, it was exactly that. It taught you how to drive, how to maintain a car, how to pay attention. It didn't overwhelm you with power or hide mistakes. It just responded. What makes the EXP important isn't performance or prestige, it's influence. Cars like this introduced an entire generation to driving during a transitional era. They made ownership possible when bigger cars no longer made sense. The Ford EXP didn't fail. It served its role quietly and moved on, and that's why it rarely gets talked about. But for the people who started there, it mattered. That's why the first generation Ford EXP deserves a second look, not as a forgotten economy car, but as a beginning. Because for many drivers, including me, it wasn't just a car, it was the start of everything. Some people may not know this about the Fox Body Mustang, but it wasn't built to impress everyone. It was built to survive. When the Fox platform arrived, performance cars were under pressure. Emissions rules, fuel economy concerns, and rising insurance costs had changed the landscape. Ford couldn't keep building the Mustang the way it had in the past, so instead of clinging to tradition, they rethought the formula. The Fox Body Mustang became lighter, simpler, and more adaptable. It wasn't overstyled, it wasn't excessive, it was honest. And that honesty gave it something earlier generations didn't have: flexibility. This generation of Mustang evolved constantly. Engines changed, suspension improved, power returned gradually. By the time the platform matured, the Fox Body had become a genuinely capable performance car, even if its looks didn't scream for attention. Here's where it became misunderstood. Many people judged it against the muscle cars that came before it. When it didn't feel the same, they assumed something was missing. But the Fox Body wasn't trying to recreate the past. It was trying to keep the Mustang relevant when relevance wasn't guaranteed. What truly defined the Fox Body wasn't a single model or spec, it was longevity. This platform carried the Mustang through more than a decade of change, uncertainty, and transition. It became the foundation for an entire generation of performance enthusiasts. That's why the Fox Body Mustang matters. It wasn't the flashiest Mustang, it wasn't the most refined, but it was the one that adapted, endured, and quietly rebuilt the Mustang's performance credibility. Sometimes the most important cars aren't the ones that shout the loudest, they're the ones that refuse to disappear. Some people may not know this about the Subaru SVX. It wasn't a sports car that failed. It was a grand touring experiment that arrived before anyone understood what it was trying to be. When Subaru introduced the SVX in the early 1990s, the brand wasn't known for luxury or design ambition. Subaru was practical, dependable, and understated. The SVX changed that overnight. Designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, the SVX looked unlike anything else on the road. The shape was low, wide, and futuristic. Most striking of all were the window within a window side glass panels, designed to reduce wind noise and improve structural rigidity. It wasn't a gimmick, it was engineering expressed through design. Under the hood was a naturally aspirated flat six, smooth, refined, and tuned for effortless cruising rather than aggression. Power went to all four wheels, reinforcing Subaru's focus on stability and confidence instead of drama. This wasn't meant to be a lightweight sports coupe. It was meant to cover long distances comfortably and quietly. Here's where the misunderstanding began. People expected the SVX to behave like a performance car. When it didn't, they dismissed it. But Subaru never positioned it as a rival to sports cars. It was a technology and design showcase, built to elevate the brand's image. The SVX didn't fail because it lacked vision. It struggled because the market wasn't ready for a Subaru positioned as a luxury grand tourer. The price was high. Expectations were confused, and the car was judged for what it wasn't instead of what it was. That's why the Subaru SVX matters. It represents a moment when Subaru tried to move beyond practicality and show what it was capable of. Many of the ideas it introduced Refinement, design confidence, all-wheel drive luxury would later define the brand. The SVX wasn't wrong, it was early, and in hindsight, that makes it one of the most fascinating cars Subaru ever built. Some people may not know this about the first generation Ford Taurus SHO. It wasn't built to look fast, it was built to change expectations. When Ford introduced the Taurus SHO at the end of the 1980s, performance sedans were not part of the mainstream conversation. Family cars were practical, sports cars were separate. The SHO quietly erased that line. At the heart of the car was something completely unexpected. A high-revving V6 developed with Yamaha. This wasn't a detuned truck engine or a marketing exercise. It was a purpose-built power plant designed for smoothness, durability, and real performance. Here's where the misunderstanding began. The Taurus SHO looked like a normal sedan. No flared fenders, no aggressive bodywork, no attempt to announce what it was. To most people, it blended into traffic, and that invisibility became part of its identity. But on the road, the SHO delivered something new: strong acceleration, composed handling, the ability to carry speed comfortably, quietly, and confidently. It wasn't dramatic, it was effective. The SHO wasn't trying to be a muscle car, it wasn't trying to replace a sports car. It was introducing a new idea that a family sedan could also be genuinely engaging to drive. That idea stuck. Today, performance sedans are everywhere, but when the first generation Taurus SHO arrived, the category barely existed. Ford didn't just build a fast Taurus, they built a blueprint. That's why the first generation Taurus SHO matters. It didn't shout, it didn't posture. It simply proved that performance and practicality didn't have to be separate ideas. And because it did that quietly, it took years for people to realize how important it really was. Some people may not know this about the first generation Honda Prelude. It wasn't trying to be a sports car, it was trying to make everyday driving feel intentional. When Honda introduced the Prelude to the US at the end of the 1970s, the company was still building its reputation. Most small coupes at the time were basic, economy focused, and forgettable. Honda took a different approach. The Prelude was compact, two-door, and sporty, but not aggressive. It focused on balance, ergonomics, and refinement rather than power or image. This wasn't about speed, it was about how the car felt to live with. Inside, the Prelude stood out immediately. The driving position was thoughtful. Controls were placed with intention. Visibility was excellent. Everything worked the way you expected it to. At a time when many cars felt cheaply assembled, the Prelude felt considered. Here's where it became overlooked. Because it wasn't loud or powerful, many people dismissed it as just another small coupe. But that misses the point. Honda wasn't chasing excitement through horsepower. They were building trust. The Prelude introduced an idea that would become central to Honda's identity, that a car could be enjoyable without being intimidating, that engineering quality mattered more than bravado, and that everyday driving deserved as much attention as performance driving. The first generation Prelude didn't fail. It succeeded quietly. It sold well, earned loyal owners, and laid the foundation for every Prelude that followed. That's why the first generation Honda Prelude matters. It represents the moment Honda showed the US market what thoughtful, driver-focused design could feel like. Not flashy, not extreme, just right, and in hindsight, that approach changed everything. Some people may not know this about the 1970s Datsun 240Z. It didn't just change sports cars, it changed who could afford one. When Datsun introduced the 240Z at the start of the 1970s, the sports car world was dominated by European brands. They were beautiful, fast, and expensive. Ownership often came with compromises, reliability issues, and high costs. The 240Z challenged that entire equation. The formula was simple but revolutionary: a lightweight chassis, rear-wheel drive, a smooth inline-six engine, clean styling, and most importantly, affordability without apology. The 240Z delivered real performance without asking buyers to tolerate fragility or expense. Here's where its importance often gets overlooked. The 240Z wasn't copying European sports cars, it was improving the idea. It offered balance instead of drama, reliability instead of mystique, and usability instead of intimidation. You could drive it hard, drive it daily, and trust it to work. That combination reshaped expectations. Buyers no longer had to choose between excitement and dependability. The 240Z proved you could have both. The car also arrived at exactly the right moment. Emissions regulations were changing, fuel costs were rising, the muscle car era was fading. The 240Z showed that performance didn't need excess to survive. Its success forced the industry to respond. European brands took notice. Japanese manufacturers gained confidence. The modern sports car market began to shift. That's why the 1970s Datsun 240Z matters. It wasn't just a great car, it was a reset, a moment when performance became accessible, usable, and honest. And decades later, its influence is still visible everywhere. Some people may not know this about the Dodge Stealth Twin Turbo. It wasn't just a badge engineered experiment, it was one of the most ambitious performance cars Dodge ever put its name on. Before we get into the specs or the reputation, there's a personal reason this car matters to me. I owned a Stealth Twin Turbo, and I remember the exact moment I saw it on the showroom floor. I fell in love with it instantly. The stance, the shape, the idea that Dodge was offering something this advanced. It didn't look like anything else in the building. When the Stealth arrived in the early 1990s, it represented a major shift. This wasn't traditional American performance, it was global. All wheel drive, twin turbocharging, four-wheel steering, active aerodynamics. Dodge wasn't playing it safe. They were swinging for relevance in a rapidly changing performance world. Here's where the Stealth became misunderstood. It was complex, heavy, packed with technology that demanded maintenance and understanding. Some people expected a simple muscle car experience and were disappointed when they didn't get it. But that was never the point. The Stealth Twin Turbo wasn't built for simplicity. It was built for capability, high speed stability, all weather confidence, effortless power delivery. When it was right, it felt planted, fast, and serious in a way few cars of its era could match. Owning it taught you something. This wasn't a car you dominated, it was a car you partnered with. And when everything came together, it delivered an experience that felt ahead of its time. That's why the 1991 Dodge Stealth Twin Turbo matters. It represents a moment when Dodge was willing to be bold, complicated, and ambitious. It wasn't perfect, but it was brave. And for those of us who owned one or fell in love with one the moment we saw it, it left a lasting impression that never really went away. Some people may not know this about the Ford Thunderbird, but the 10th generation wasn't about nostalgia. It was about redefining what a personal luxury coupe could be in a changing era. When Ford introduced this generation of Thunderbird, the automotive world was moving away from raw muscle and toward refinement. Cars were becoming more aerodynamic, more composed, and more focused on comfort and stability at speed. Ford leaned into that shift instead of fighting it. This generation emphasized balance over bravado, independent rear suspension, a smooth, controlled ride, a design meant for long distances rather than stoplight drama. It wasn't trying to be loud, it was trying to be confident. Here's where it gets personal. I own one of these cars. And for whatever strange reason, it sits in my top five favorite cars I've ever owned. Not because it's the fastest, not because it's the rarest, but because of how it feels to live with. It's comfortable without being dull, stable without being soft. There's a sense of calm to the way it drives that you don't expect until you spend real time with it. This is a car that rewards maturity, not aggression. That's also why this generation became misunderstood. Many people compared it to earlier Thunderbirds and assumed something had been lost. But that comparison misses the point. This car wasn't meant to recreate the past. It was meant to move the nameplate forward. Today, I genuinely love to find another clean example, not as a collectible, not as an investment, but because this generation of Thunderbird represents a kind of automotive confidence that feels rare now. That's why it matters. The 10th generation Thunderbird wasn't flashy, it wasn't extreme, but it was purposeful. And sometimes those are the cars that stay with you the longest. Some people may not know this about the Pontiac Grand Prix GTP Supercharged, but it wasn't trying to be flashy. It was trying to be effective. By the early 2000s, performance sedans were becoming more common, but most of them were either expensive or subtle to the point of invisibility. Pontiac took a different approach. The Grand Prix GTP was designed to feel fast in everyday driving, not just on paper. At the heart of the car was a supercharged V6, tuned for torque rather than theatrics. Power came on early and stayed consistent, making the car feel strong in real-world situations like merging, passing, and highway driving. This wasn't performance you had to chase. It was always there. Here's where the misunderstanding started. Because it was front-wheel drive, many people dismissed it immediately. But Pontiac engineered the chassis to manage that power confidently. The suspension was firm without being harsh, the steering was direct, and the car felt planted when driven the way most people actually drive. The GTP also nailed something Pontiac had always understood. Performance should feel accessible. You didn't need to rev it out. You didn't need perfect conditions. The car delivered its personality without demanding effort or compromise. Over time, the Grand Prix GTP faded from conversation as tastes changed and sedans lost favor. But that doesn't mean it failed. It simply belonged to a moment when performance was being redefined for daily use. That's why the 2001 Pontiac Grand Prix GTP Supercharged matters. It represents a time when American manufacturers were figuring out how to blend comfort, usability, and speed into one honest package. Not loud, not rare, but memorable for the people who lived with it. Some people may not know this about the Buick Grand National. It wasn't built to look fast. It was built to end conversations. When Buick introduced the Grand National in the 1980s, performance was still expected to come from V8 engines, loud styling, and muscle car theatrics. Buick ignored all of that and delivered something far more unsettling. The Grand National was blacked out, understated, and deliberately restrained. No stripes, no bright trim, no effort to draw attention. Under the hood was a turbocharged V6, an engine configuration most people dismissed before it ever turned a wheel. That dismissal didn't last long. The Grand National delivered torque immediately and relentlessly. In real world driving, it was faster than cars that looked far more aggressive. It didn't need to rev, it didn't need to announce itself, it simply went. Here's why it became misunderstood. Enthusiasts expected a muscle car experience. When they didn't get one, they underestimated it. But the Grand National wasn't trying to relive the past, it was quietly demonstrating the future. Turbocharging, engine management, traction through control instead of displacement. Buick was showing that performance could come from intelligence, not excess. The car's reputation grew not because of marketing, but because of results. On the street, it embarrassed cars that were supposed to be faster, and it did it without drama. That's why the Buick Grand National matters. It represents a moment when American performance changed direction, when silence became threatening, when restraint became confidence. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was feared, and decades later, that reputation still holds. Some people may not know this about the Mazda RX-7 Turbo 2, but it wasn't built to dominate spec sheets. It was built to reward drivers who cared about feel. By 1991, the RX-7 had already earned a reputation, but the Turbo 2 version refined everything that made the car special. Lightweight construction, near perfect balance, and a turbocharged rotary engine that didn't rely on brute force, but on engagement. The rotary was the heart of the experience. Smooth, eager, and willing to rev, it delivered power differently than anything else on the road. Boost came on progressively, encouraging momentum instead of shortcuts. You didn't muscle this car, you worked with it. That's what set the Turbo 2 apart. It wasn't about drag races or straight line dominance. It was about corners, feedback, and rhythm. Steering that communicated a chassis that stayed neutral, a sense that every input mattered. Here's where the misunderstanding started. Many people judged the RX-7 by its engine layout instead of its driving experience. Concerns about maintenance or unfamiliar technology overshadowed what the car actually delivered when driven as intended. But people who spent real time behind the wheel understood it immediately. The 1991 RX-7 Turbo 2 wasn't flashy. It didn't shout. It simply connected driver and machine in a way that was becoming increasingly rare even then. That's why people who drove one never forgot it. Not because it was the fastest car of its era, but because it taught you how rewarding driving could be when balance mattered more than numbers. Some people may not know this about the Dodge Shelby Charger, but it wasn't built to win drag races. It was built to prove that performance could survive in a front-wheel drive world. In the early 1980s, Dodge was struggling with image. Muscle cars were gone, fuel economy mattered, and the brand needed credibility. That's when Carroll Shelby stepped in, not to recreate the past, but to adapt to the present. The Shelby Charger was based on a front-wheel drive hatchback, which immediately turned off traditional enthusiasts. But Shelby focused on what mattered: suspension tuning, chassis balance, steering response. The goal wasn't brute force, it was control. As the program evolved, so did the power. Turbocharged 2.2-liter engines gave the car real urgency, especially in everyday driving. By the time the GLH-S arrived, output climbed to 175 horsepower, serious numbers for a lightweight front-drive car of the era. Here's where the Shelby Charger became misunderstood. People fixated on what it wasn't. It wasn't rear-wheel drive. It wasn't a V8. And because of that, many dismissed it outright. But that misses the point. The Shelby Charger was about affordable performance at a time when that idea was almost disappearing. It rewarded drivers who valued handling, feedback, and momentum over theatrics. It wasn't trying to be intimidating, it was trying to be effective. That's why the Dodge Shelby Charger matters. It represents a moment when performance adapted instead of retreating, when a legendary name was used not to sell nostalgia, but to push a struggling brand forward. It didn't shout, it didn't posture, but it proved that fun, affordable driving still had a place, even when the rules had changed. Some people may not know this about the 1999 Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution 6, but it wasn't built to be admired. It was built to win. By the time the Evo 6 arrived, Mitsubishi wasn't chasing trends or comfort. This car existed for one reason: rally homologation. Everything else came second. The design, the suspension, the drivetrain, even the interior all served a single purpose. Under the hood was a turbocharged four-cylinder, but power alone wasn't the story. What made the Evo 6 special was how it put that power down. Advanced all-wheel drive, active differentials, a chassis tuned for grip on unpredictable surfaces. The car didn't feel fast in isolation. It felt unstoppable. Here's where the misunderstanding comes in. Many people see the Evo as just another tuner icon: loud, aggressive, and overstyled. But the Evo 6 wasn't built for the street scene. It was built to survive brutal rally stages and still be driven home. Behind the wheel, the car feels tightly wound and purposeful. Steering is quick. Responses are immediate. The car always feels like it's a step ahead of the driver, urging you to trust it and commit. The Evo 6 represents the peak of a philosophy that doesn't really exist anymore. A time when manufacturers built road cars purely to justify competition cars. Comfort was optional, feedback was mandatory. That's why the 1999 Evo 6 matters. It wasn't about image or lifestyle, it was about capability. And for drivers who experienced one, that focus was unforgettable. Some people may not know this about the Chevrolet Camaro, but the third generation wasn't about raw muscle. It was about survival through reinvention. When this generation arrived, the rules had changed. Emissions, fuel economy, and insurance costs had reshaped performance cars. The excess of the 70s was gone, and the traditional muscle car formula no longer worked. Chevrolet didn't fight that reality, they adapted to it. The third generation Camaro became lighter, lower, and far more aerodynamic. Handling started to matter, chassis balance mattered, technology mattered. This wasn't a car designed to intimidate at idle, it was designed to function in a new world. Here's where it became misunderstood. Many people compared it to earlier Camaros and assumed something had been lost. But that comparison ignores the context. This generation wasn't trying to relive the past. It was trying to keep the Camaro name alive when the segment itself was under threat. Over its long production run, the third gen Camaro evolved quietly. Power improved, suspension tuning improved, special models proved the platform had real capability. By the end, it was a far more competent car than many people remember. What makes this generation important isn't nostalgia, it's resilience. The third generation Camaro carried the name through a period when performance cars could have disappeared entirely. It wasn't the loudest Camaro, it wasn't the most powerful, but it was the one that adapted, endured, and set the stage for everything that came after. And that's why the third generation Camaro deserves more credit than it usually gets. Some people may not know this about the Pontiac Firehawk, but it wasn't just a trim level. It was a deliberate escalation. The fourth generation Firehawk existed because Pontiac believed the Firebird platform could handle more power, more grip, more responsibility. And instead of building it in house, they turned to SLP engineering to do what Pontiac couldn't officially do on its own. That decision changed everything. The Firehawk wasn't about appearance. Every major change was functional. The twin nostril hood wasn't styling, it was airflow. The suspension wasn't softened for comfort, it was tightened for control. The exhaust wasn't tuned for sound alone, it was tuned to breathe. Under the hood, power came from serious engines. Early cars relied on the LT1V8, delivering 300 horsepower at a time when that number still meant something. Later versions received the LS1, pushing performance even further. In the real world, these cars were brutally effective. Here's where the Firehawk earned its reputation. Acceleration was immediate. Grip was confident. High-speed stability was exceptional. Early fourth-generation cars could reach 60 miles per hour in under 5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s. Those weren't just good numbers. They were Corvette-level numbers. And that's why the Firehawk became known as a Corvette killer. Not because it was louder, not because it was flashier, but because it delivered similar performance at a lower cost, often with a 6-speed manual and everyday usability. The Firehawk was never mass-produced, it was limited, purpose-built, and aimed directly at drivers who wanted serious capability without giving up daily drivability. That's why the fourth-generation Firehawk still matters. It represents a moment when Pontiac pushed right up to the edge of what was allowed, and SLP helped them cross it responsibly. Not a show car, not a gimmick, just execution. Some people may not know this about the Dodge Spirit RT, but it was a genuinely serious performance sedan for its era, and most people never paid much attention to it. At a glance, the Spirit RT looked ordinary. Four doors, conservative proportions, no aggressive styling cues to warn you what it was capable of, and that was part of the point. This car wasn't built to announce itself. Under the hood, though, was something very different. A turbocharged 2.2-liter engine with a 16-valve head designed by Lotus. This wasn't marketing fluff. It was real engineering, and it delivered real results. When it arrived, the Spirit RT was the fastest production sedan in America, 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds. Quarter-mile performance that embarrassed cars that looked far more serious. It wasn't quick for a sedan, it was simply quick. Here's where it became overlooked. People expected performance to look aggressive. When the Spirit RT didn't, they dismissed it. But this car wasn't built to impress in a parking lot, it was built to surprise on the road. Power delivery was immediate. Torque came on early. In everyday driving, the car felt strong without needing to be pushed. You didn't have to wring it out to understand what it could do. In many ways, the Spirit RT was ahead of its time. A turbocharged four-door built around usable performance, restraint, and confidence. That approach would later define an entire generation of modern performance sedans. That's why the 1991 Spirit RT still matters. It proved that performance didn't need a costume. Sometimes the most capable cars are the ones that don't ask for attention at all. Some people may not know this about the Chrysler LeBaron, but it wasn't trying to be a sports car. It was trying to be something far more important. By the late 1980s and early 90s, convertibles were disappearing. Rising safety standards, higher costs, and changing tastes had pushed most manufacturers away from open-top cars entirely. Chrysler didn't fight that trend with performance. They fought it with accessibility. The third-generation LeBaron convertible made open-air driving available to people who would never have considered a traditional roadster. It was comfortable, approachable, stylish in a restrained way. You didn't buy it to race, you bought it to enjoy the drive. That's where it became misunderstood. Because it wasn't fast or aggressive, many people dismissed it. But the Liberon wasn't built for enthusiasts chasing lap times. It was built for everyday drivers who wanted a sense of freedom without sacrificing comfort or practicality. It was a car you could drive to work, to dinner, or on a weekend trip with the top down and not think twice about it. In many ways, it helped normalize the idea that convertibles didn't have to be exotic or expensive to be enjoyable. The LeBaron also marked an important moment for Chrysler. It showed the company could blend style, comfort, and mass appeal during a period when its future was far from certain. That mattered. The third-generation LeBaron convertible wasn't flashy. It wasn't rare. But it represented a time when automakers still believed joy didn't need to be extreme to be meaningful, and that's why it deserves more credit than it usually gets. Some people may not know this about the AMC Eagle, but it quietly created a segment decades before anyone knew what to call it. When the Eagle arrived in the early 1980s, it didn't fit neatly into any category. It wasn't a truck, it wasn't an off-road toy, and it wasn't a traditional station wagon either. Instead, it blended everyday comfort with full-time four-wheel drive in a way no American car had done before. AMC took the ride quality and interior familiarity of a passenger wagon and combined it with hardware borrowed directly from its Jeep division. A lifted suspension, real four-wheel drive capability, protective body cladding, all without asking drivers to give up comfort or practicality. At the time, this approach confused people. Most buyers didn't know what to make of a wagon that could handle snow, mud, and rough roads without looking like a utility vehicle. The Eagle wasn't marketed as revolutionary. It was simply presented as sensible transportation for unpredictable conditions. That subtlety is why it became misunderstood. But looking back, the AMC Eagle clearly set the template for what we now call the crossover, a vehicle that prioritizes all-weather confidence, usability, and comfort over extreme off-road capability. Long before the Subaru Outback, long before crossovers became dominant, the Eagle had already solved the problem. The market just wasn't ready yet. Production ended in the late 1980s, but the idea never disappeared. It simply waited for the world to catch up. That's why the AMC Eagle matters, not because it was flashy or fast, but because it was early. And in the automotive world, being early is often harder than being right. Some people may not know this about the AMC AM van turbo concept, but it wasn't a styling exercise. It was a glimpse into a future that arrived decades later. In 1977, AMC unveiled the AM van concept as part of its Traveling Concept 80 show. At a time when vans were becoming practical appliances, AMC took a radically different approach. They asked what would happen if utility didn't have to mean compromise. The AM van was low, wide, and aggressively styled. Its proportions felt closer to a sports car than a family hauler. Wide tires, dramatic bodywork, and a performance-oriented stance made it clear this wasn't about cargo space or convenience. It was about presence and intent. The turbo branding wasn't subtle either. AMC was signaling that performance and utility didn't have to live in separate categories. That idea was extreme for the late 1970s when most manufacturers were retreating from performance altogether. At the time, the concept felt confusing, too radical, too niche, too far removed from what buyers expected, and because of that, it was easy to dismiss. But looking back, the AM van reads very differently. It predicted a world filled with performance crossovers, sport-focused utility vehicles, and lifestyle-driven designs. Vehicles that blend everyday usefulness with speed, attitude, and identity. Concepts that today feel normal, but in 1977 were almost unthinkable. AMC didn't have the resources to bring something like the AM van to production. The company was already fighting to survive, but the idea itself didn't disappear. It simply waited for the rest of the industry to catch up. That's why the AM van turbo concept matters, not because it was ever built, but because it understood where the market was heading long before anyone else was ready to go there. Some concepts show what could be built, others show what will be built. The AM van was the second kind. Some people may not know this about the first generation Eagle Talon, but it helped introduce an entire generation of drivers to serious performance without asking them to be experts first. When the Talon arrived in the early 1990s, it didn't look radical. It was a compact coupe with clean lines and restrained styling, but underneath, it represented a major shift in how performance could be delivered. Turbocharging, available all-wheel drive, lightweight construction. The Talon wasn't about overpowering the driver, it was about balance, traction, and confidence. You didn't have to fight the car to go fast, you just had to trust it. That's where it became misunderstood. Because the Talon shared its platform with the Mitsubishi Eclipse and Plymouth Laser, many people dismissed it as badge engineering. But that perspective misses what made the car important. It wasn't about exclusivity, it was about accessibility. The Talon brought advanced performance technology to drivers who would never have owned a traditional sports car. It was quick, composed, and forgiving, especially in real-world conditions. Snow, rain, imperfect roads. This was performance you could actually use. For many drivers, the first generation Talon was a gateway. It taught people about boost, drivetrain balance, and driver input. It showed that speed didn't have to be loud or intimidating to be meaningful. That's why the first generation Eagle Talon still matters. Not because it was rare or luxurious, but because it changed expectations. It made performance feel attainable, approachable, and repeatable. Some cars build legends, others build drivers. Some people may not know this about the first generation Pontiac Fiero, but it wasn't supposed to be a sports car, and that misunderstanding shaped its entire legacy. When the Fiero debuted in the mid 1980s, Pontiac wasn't chasing performance headlines. The original idea was a fuel efficient commuter car with a mid engine layout, something lightweight, innovative, and economical. That mission mattered because it explains almost every criticism that followed. The layout was revolutionary for an American production car, mid-engine, plastic body panels, space frame construction. Nothing else like it existed in Pontiac showrooms or most American showrooms at all, but expectations got ahead of reality. Because it looked exotic, people expected it to perform like a sports car from day one. Early versions didn't. They were modestly powered, tuned for efficiency, and built with parts chosen to meet budget and reliability goals, not lap times. That's where the Fiero became misunderstood. Pontiac listened. Suspension improved, power increased, handling was refined. By the time the platform matured, the Fiero had become a genuinely capable driver's car. Unfortunately, that progress arrived just as the program was ending. The irony is that the Fiero didn't fail because of what it was. It failed because of what people wanted it to be before it was allowed to get there. Today, the first generation Fiero stands as something rare in American automotive history, a bold experiment. A mid-engine idea that broke convention. A car that tried something new when playing it safe would have been easier. Not every important car gets to finish its story, but that doesn't make the beginning any less meaningful. Some people don't realize this, but the Volkswagen Golf Mark IV wasn't just another generation update. It was the moment the Golf became modern. From 1997 to 2003, the Mark IV transformed the Golf from a practical hatchback into something that felt genuinely premium. The doors closed with a solid sound. The interior materials were refined. The driving position felt intentional. It didn't feel like a budget car anymore. But the real story wasn't just build quality, it was variety. You could get a 1.8 turbo, you could get a VR6, and if you were paying attention, you could get one of the most important hot hatches of the era. The Mark IV was also the generation that exploded in tuner culture. Coilovers, big wheels, Eurotails, clean OEM Plus builds. It wasn't just a car, it became a platform, and here's what made it stick. It balanced refinement with performance. It wasn't raw like earlier generations. It wasn't oversized like later ones. It sat right in the middle. Comfortable enough for daily driving, capable enough to have real fun. The all wheel drive R32 variant sealed the legacy, a narrow angle six-cylinder engine with that unmistakable exhaust tone. It felt different, special, intentional. The Mark IV didn't invent the hot hatch, but it perfected the formula for a new generation. That's why it still shows up at meets. That's why clean examples are getting harder to find. It wasn't flashy, it was foundational. Some people may not know this about the 2004 Chevrolet Cavalier two door, but it might have been one of the most relatable cars of its era. By the early 2000s, the Cavalier wasn't trying to reinvent anything. It wasn't chasing luxury, it wasn't chasing performance headlines. It was built to be accessible, affordable, simple, easy to own. And that mattered. The two-door version gave it just enough personality to feel different from the four-door commuter version. It looked sportier, even if it wasn't pretending to be a sports car. For a lot of people, this wasn't a dream car, it was a first car. The Cavalier delivered straightforward reliability and low ownership cost at a time when many buyers just needed something dependable. The Ecotec engine brought better refinement and efficiency compared to earlier versions. It wasn't fast, but it was honest. Here's where it became overlooked because it was so common. You saw them in every parking lot, every high school, every apartment complex. And when something becomes that normal, it stops being appreciated. But normal doesn't mean unimportant. The 2004 Cavalier two door represented a transitional moment for General Motors. It carried the compact segment through a period when the company was still trying to modernize. It gave a generation mobility without drama. It wasn't built to be legendary, it was built to be useful. And sometimes the cars that quietly show up every day matter just as much as the ones that grab headlines. Some people may not know this about the first generation Mazda Miata, but it didn't just revive the Roadster, it reset what fun meant. When the Miata arrived in 1989 for the 1990 model year, small lightweight sports cars were disappearing. British roadsters were unreliable. European alternatives were expensive. The formula seemed outdated. Mazda looked at that and made a simple decision: keep it light, keep it balanced, keep it honest. The first generation Miata weighed barely over 2,000 pounds. It had a modest four-cylinder engine, no huge power numbers, no aggressive styling, just a tight chassis, a five-speed manual, and near perfect balance. And then there were the pop-up headlights. That detail alone made it feel playful, intentional, like it wasn't taking itself too seriously. Here's why the first generation Miata became so important. It wasn't about horsepower, it was about feel, steering feedback, shifter precision, the way the car rotated through a corner without fighting you. You didn't overpower it, you worked with it. That philosophy mattered. The Miata proved that fun didn't require excess. It didn't require huge engines or massive tires. It required connection. The first generation Miata didn't try to be intimidating. It tried to be engaging. And because of that, it became one of the most successful sports cars ever built. Not flashy, not dramatic, just right. Some people may not know this about the Dodge Rampage, but it wasn't trying to be a truck. It was trying to be practical in a different way. When the Rampage arrived in the early 1980s, compact pickups were gaining popularity. Most were traditional body on frame trucks built primarily for work. Dodge took another path. The Rampage was front wheel drive. It shared its foundation with compact passenger cars. It drove more like a coupe than a pickup, and that alone made it unusual. My grandfather actually had one. and I always loved driving it. It didn't feel like a truck at all. It felt light, simple, and easy. You could throw it around corners in a way you'd never expect from something with a bed in the back. The goal wasn't heavy duty hauling, it was everyday usability. A small four-cylinder engine, a light chassis, car like suspension. You could use it for light duty work, but it was much easier to live with than a traditional pickup. Here's where it became misunderstood. People expected it to behave like a truck. When it didn't, they dismissed it. But the Rampage wasn't built for job sites, it was built for drivers who wanted utility without sacrificing comfort. Looking back, it feels ahead of its time. Today, car based utility vehicles and lifestyle pickups are common. In the early 1980s, the idea felt strange. The Rampage didn't fail because it was wrong. It just arrived before buyers were ready for something that blended categories. It wasn't powerful, it wasn't aggressive, but for some of us, it was memorable. And sometimes that's enough. Some people may not know this about the Cadillac CTS-V, but it wasn't built to participate. It was built to compete. When Cadillac introduced the first generation CTS-V in the mid 2000s, the goal was clear. This wasn't about adding a little extra power to a luxury sedan. It was about proving that an American four-door could take on the best performance sedans in the world. Under the hood was a V8 borrowed from the Corvette, rear-wheel drive, and a six-speed manual transmission, not as an option, as the only choice. That decision mattered. Cadillac wasn't easing into performance, they were committing to it. If you wanted a CTS-V, you were going to shift it yourself. But what made the CTS-V important wasn't just straight line speed, it was composure. The chassis was tuned seriously. Steering feel mattered, braking mattered, high speed stability mattered. This wasn't a soft luxury car pretending to be aggressive. It was engineered to handle real performance driving. Here's where it surprised people because it wore a Cadillac badge. For years, Cadillac had been associated with comfort more than competition. The CTS-V forced enthusiasts to reconsider what the brand was capable of. Later generations added more power, more refinement, and even automatic options. But that first CTS-V set the tone, performance without apology. The first CTS-V didn't ask for permission, it showed up ready.
Some people don't realize this, but the Acura Integra GSR wasn't just a Honda with a nicer badge. It was the high school dream car for an entire generation. From 1994 to 2001, the GSR came with a 1.8 liter naturally aspirated VTEC engine that made about 170 horsepower. That doesn't sound huge today, but when the VTEC crossover hit around 5,700 RPM and it pulled all the way to 8 grand, felt special. 5-speed manual, lightweight chassis, double wishbone suspension. It wasn't about straight line dominance, it was about feel. It was affordable enough to dream about, but just expensive enough to feel elite. White wheels, clean coupe lines, that subtle real spoiler, black leather interior. If you were in high school in the late 90s or early 2000s, this was the car you stared at in the parking lot. And here's the thing, it still holds up. No fake aggression, no forced drama, just balance, revs, and connection. The GSR wasn't trying to be a supercar. It was trying to make you fall in love with driving. And for a lot of us, it worked.
Some people may not know this about the 1998 Saab 900, but it marked the quiet end of something unique. By 1998, the Saab 900 wasn't the original quirky, front-hinged hood, wraparound windshield version from the 80s. This was the second generation car built during a period when Saab was adapting to new ownership and modern expectations, but it still felt different. The ignition was between the seats, the dashboard wrapped toward the driver. The seats were firm, supportive, and designed for long-distance comfort in harsh climates. Saab engineering still prioritized safety and practicality over flash. And then there was the turbo. Saab didn't use turbocharging as a headline feature. They used it as a philosophy: smooth, usable torque, mid-range pull. Performance that felt effortless rather than dramatic. The 1998 model year was significant because it was the final chapter before the name changed to 9.3. Mechanically similar, yes, but symbolically, it marked the end of the 900 badge, a name that had built Saab's identity for decades. Here's where the 900 became misunderstood. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it wasn't trying to compete with German sports sedans directly. It was built for drivers who valued engineering decisions that made sense in the real world. cold weather reliability, high speed stability, solid road feel, practical hatchback space. The 1998 Saab 900 wasn't trying to be mainstream. It was trying to stay Saab. And in many ways, it was the last time the 900 name carried that balance before everything shifted. Some people may not know this about the Chevy SSR, but it wasn't trying to make sense. It was trying to make a statement. When Chevrolet introduced the SSR in the early 2000s, retro styling was having a moment. The PT Cruiser, the Thunderbird, the HHR, nostalgia was selling, but the SSR went further than most. It wasn't just retro, it was a convertible pickup truck. That alone made it unusual. A folding hardtop, rear-wheel drive, and eventually a V8 under the hood. Early models came with modest power, but later versions received a stronger small block engine and even a manual transmission option. And that's where things get interesting. The SSR wasn't built for heavy duty work. It wasn't built for track performance either. It existed somewhere in between. Part showpiece, part cruiser, part experiment. Here's why it became polarizing. People couldn't categorize it. It wasn't a traditional truck. It wasn't a sports car. It wasn't a muscle car. And because it didn't fit neatly into one segment, many dismissed it outright. But the SSR represents a specific era in American automotive history, a time when manufacturers were willing to take risks on niche, character-driven vehicles. It was bold, it was different, and it refused to blend in. The Chevy SSR didn't try to be practical, it tried to be memorable, and whether you loved it or questioned it, you remembered it. Some people may not know this about the 1995 to 1999 Nissan Maxima SE 5-speed, but it was the four-door sports car before that phrase became marketing copy. In the mid-90s, most family sedans were built for comfort first, soft suspensions, automatic transmissions, minimal personality. The Maxima SE went in a different direction. It came with a 3-liter V6 that made real power for the time. Paired with a 5-speed manual transmission, it felt immediate and responsive in a way most four-door cars simply didn't. This wasn't about raw muscle. It was about balance. The chassis was tight. The steering had weight. The car felt planted at highway speeds and surprisingly composed through corners. It didn't try to pretend it was a sports car. It just quietly behaved like one. And here's why it stuck. It looked normal. No giant wings, no aggressive body kits, just a clean sedan shape hiding real performance underneath. If you knew, you knew. The Maxima SE 5-speed became the car that surprised people at stoplights. It was quick enough to embarrass cars that looked faster, but it was still practical enough to drive every day without drama. For a lot of people, this wasn't just a sedan. It was the first time they realized a four-door didn't have to be boring. The 1995 to 1999 Maxima SE wasn't flashy, it was confident, and that's why people still talk about it. Some people don't realize this, but the Mitsubishi Galant Vi R4 was one of the most serious sedans of the early 90s, and most people forgot it existed. Before the Lancer Evolution became a rally legend, there was this. The Galant Vi R4 was Mitsubishi's homologation special, turbocharged, all-wheel drive, 5-speed manual, built so the company could compete in World Rally Championship events. Under the hood was a 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder sending power to all four wheels, not flashy, not loud, just effective. And here's what made it different. It looked like a normal sedan, no dramatic bodywork, no oversized wings, no attention-grabbing styling. If you didn't know what the VR4 badge meant, you'd assume it was just another commuter car. But on the road, it wasn't normal. The turbo delivered strong mid-range pull. The all-wheel drive system gave it confidence in all weather, and the chassis felt planted in a way most front-wheel drive sedans of the era simply didn't. This wasn't about marketing, it was about engineering. The Galant VR4 was limited in production. Each car even carried a numbered badge. It wasn't built for mass appeal, it was built to qualify for competition. And that's why it matters. The Galant VR4 wasn't loud about its capability, it just had it. Before the Evo became the headline, this was the foundation. And most people never even noticed. Some people don't realize this, but the 2003 to 2004 Mercury Marauder was one of the last true American sleeper sedans. On the surface, it looked like a Crown Victoria, big, comfortable, conservative, the kind of car you'd expect to see in a rental lot or government fleet. And that was the point. Under the hood was a 4.6-liter dual overhead cam V8, the same basic architecture found in the Mustang Mach-1 of the era. Rear-wheel drive, proper gearing, real presence. But what made the Marauder different wasn't just the engine, it was the attitude. All black paint, black wheels, subtle badging, no bright trim. It didn't shout about what it could do. It just sat there quietly, looking heavy and unbothered, and then it moved. For a full size sedan, it was legitimately quick for its time. Smooth power delivery, solid highway pull, a chassis that felt planted instead of floaty. It wasn't a track car, it was a high speed cruiser with confidence. Here's why it's gaining momentum now. It represents something that doesn't really exist anymore: a large rear wheel drive American sedan with a naturally aspirated V8 and no gimmicks. The Marauder didn't try to reinvent anything. It just gave enthusiasts what they were about to lose, and that's why the nostalgia wave around this car is only getting stronger. Some people may not know this about the Chrysler Crossfire SRT6, but it was one of the quickest American branded cars of the mid 2000s. Introduced for the 2005 model year, it was developed during the Daimler Chrysler era and built in Germany, sharing much of its foundation with the Mercedes Benz SLK 32 AMG. What made it interesting was what sat under the hood: a supercharged 3.2-liter V6, producing 330 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. That power went to the rear wheels through a 5 speed automatic, delivering strong acceleration and a surprisingly refined driving experience. It was often misunderstood because it did not fit the traditional SRT formula. There was no manual transmission, and it did not shout for attention. The styling remained sharp but controlled. Some buyers expected something louder or more aggressive. What made it matter, though, was how composed it felt. The suspension was tuned specifically for this model, the brakes were upgraded, and the chassis felt tight and confident at speed. It was less about drama and more about capability. Looking back now, the Crossfire SRT6 represents a rare moment when American performance branding and German engineering aligned almost completely. That combination gives it a distinct place in early 2000 performance history. Some people may not know this about the Kia Stinger, but it marked a turning point not just for Kia, but for how the industry viewed the brand. When it arrived for the 2018 model year, it was clear this was not another economy focused sedan. It was rear wheel drive based, available with a twin turbocharged V6, and tuned with input from engineers who had worked on European performance cars. What made it interesting was its ambition. The Stinger GT produced 365 horsepower and sent power through an 8 speed automatic to either the rear wheels or all four wheels. It was quick, composed, and surprisingly refined at highway speeds. It was often misunderstood because of the badge on the hood. Some buyers struggled to see a Kia as a true sports sedan competitor to established European brands. The performance was there, but perception took longer to shift. What made it matter was the statement it represented. The Stinger proved that engineering and driving dynamics could redefine a brand's image in a single generation. Looking back, the Kia Stinger feels like a confident declaration that performance credibility is earned on the road, not just through heritage. Some people may not know this about the 2003-2004 Infiniti G35 sedan 6 speed, but it was one of the few true driver focused four doors of the early 2000s. At a time when most midsize sedans prioritize comfort first, this one quietly offered rear-wheel drive and a proper manual transmission. What made it interesting was the foundation. It used the early VQ35 engine, producing around 260 horsepower in sedan form, paired with a 6 speed manual that felt mechanical and direct. Power delivery was smooth but urgent at higher revs, and the chassis balance reflected its shared architecture with the contemporary Z car. It was often misunderstood because it wore a luxury badge. Buyers saw leather and refinement, not necessarily performance intent. But underneath, the proportions and layout were serious. What made it matter was accessibility. It gave enthusiasts a practical four-door that still prioritized driver engagement. Rear-wheel drive, manual control, and everyday usability in one package. Looking back now, the 2003-2004 G35 sedan 6 speed represents a rare moment when luxury and analog driving feel overlapped in a way that feels harder to find Some today. People may not know this about the 1995-1998 Buick Riviera Supercharged, but it was one of the most quietly confident American coupes of its era. In the mid 1990s, while performance headlines focused on rear wheel drive muscle, this front wheel drive luxury coupe took a different path. What made it interesting was what sat under the hood: a supercharged 3.8-liter V6, producing around 240 horsepower and a strong wave of torque low in the rev range. It was not about high rev drama. It was about smooth, immediate pull that made highway passing effortless and composed. It was often misunderstood because it wore a Buick badge and prioritized refinement. The styling was rounded and understated. The cabin focused on comfort and insulation rather than aggression. Many overlooked how substantial the powertrain really was. What made it matter was balance. The Riviera delivered real torque, a stable chassis, and long distance comfort in one package. It proved that performance did not always have to shout. Looking back now, the 1995 to 1998 Riviera Supercharged represents a moment when American luxury coupes blended quiet strength with everyday usability in a way that feels increasingly rare.